Hello, my name is Alex, and welcome to another episode of the PAX podcast. Today we're sitting down with Stephen Kanter, who is the Dean of Lewis and Clark Law and has done a lot of work with constitutional law. So hello, how's it going today?
Hi Alex, great to see you this morning. I should say I'm Dean Emeritus. I was Dean quite a long time ago,
okay.
but I've been a law faculty member for a long time, and I have several wonderful successors as Dean, including our current Dean, Dean Johnson. But pleasure to be here. Good to see you again.
Thank you, and thanks for coming. Last time we saw each other was at the PAX event called Intersections of Activism, where we had three really cool speakers talk about different ways you can get involved kind of in the community, and your talk was really interesting in regards to some of the electoral college issues that people have been talking about, because this event took place right after the election, so that was kind of the main topic, I suppose.
Right, yes, I thought that was a very interesting event. I greatly enjoyed listening to the other speakers as well. There's been, of course, now we're almost a couple of months into the presidency, but I think really I had three general topics or points, and I still think they're essentially valid. One is, it is useful to go back and assess the election, and my sense of the election is that, while obviously it was a very unusual election, that in most respects, it really is not so much that Donald Trump won the presidential election, but rather that the Democrats lost a number of opportunities and did not run a very good campaign, at least not an effective response to Mr. Trump. When you look at the number of votes that he got, the popular vote, he got about the same number as the previous two losing Republican candidates. But the Democrats got fewer votes than President Obama got, quite a bit fewer than 2008 and even fewer than 2012 as well, although not quite as many. So it was certainly a close election, and there's a lot of controversy whenever there's a close election. This was a particularly controversial election. But I think it is useful to keep some perspective and not overreact to any one event. And of course, there was a lot of talk right after the election, and there's been talk for a while about the electoral system, whether the electoral college is the way to go, or whether we should think about a constitutional amendment to go to a popular vote. There are also some other proposals out there to try to effectively make the popular vote determinative without changing the Constitution. Frankly, one thing I would urge is a little bit of caution. First of all, I doubt any of these are going to happen. And I think we ought to be realistic about that and deal with the politics that we have, rather than thinking that we're going to be able to make a massive structural change. Secondly, I'm not even so sure that it's a wonderful idea. I think, at least some of the ideas that are out there, I think it's a mistake to change structure because you're unhappy with one particular result or even a few particular results. It's easy to retrospectively say, well, if we had just had the popular vote, things would have come out more on the side that I favor. And of course, that's always the case. One side or the other is going to feel that way in a very close election, as we did have a close election. One interesting thing, I'm not so sure that the Electoral College itself is even really the root of the problem. When you think about the nature of our national politics and the way that we have the House theoretically proportioned to population, the Senate quite different based on the states, when you look at the original 13 states, the population disparities among them, although there were big and small states, were not nearly as great as they are today. So in those days, the largest population state, Virginia, had about 10 times the population of the smallest state.
Yeah, that's not true anymore.
Not anymore. Now, California is well over 60 times the population of Wyoming, and yet both California and Wyoming still get 2 senators. Of course, that's the way the Constitution is structured. And when you think about it, that really affects our politics, perhaps in a greater way than the Electoral College, because it's ongoing day to day. It means that the Senate is more disparate from a population point of view than it was in the original configuration, and it's gotten to be a fairly extreme amount. Again, I doubt we're going to do anything about that either, but actually, theoretically, this isn't going to happen, but theoretically, that could be changed without constitutional amendment. States, it does require their own consent, can be broken up into 2 or more states. And so theoretically, you could take the very large population states like California, New York, Texas, which don't share the same politics. And, if there were, as I say, this is pie in the sky, but if they were broken into smaller states, then, and then ideally, if you were really trying to redress this issue, pair a couple of adjacent, very small population states to become one, have a little broader, and while they would lose Senate representation if they did that, which means it's unlikely they would do it, there might be some economic and regional advantages for a couple of contiguous states to think about becoming one. As I say, this isn't going to happen any more than the constitutional amendment, but at least it's an interesting thing to think about because the Senate operates every day, and it's extremely difficult, as we've seen, to get anything through the Senate from either side. We've gotten into a very difficult situation. And secondly, of course, the number of senators is one of the determining factors on how many electors each state has. So if there were a closer to population parity in the Senate, then you would reduce the swings in the Electoral College as well. But I don't think we're going to get to any next thing. Frankly, I think by the time the next presidential election comes along, people will still be talking about it, but the big issues will be who can find a national strategy of appealing in a sustained way, not just for that one day of the presidential election, but to build a working coalition and a positive agenda that will attract a sufficient number of people. And that's a long-term process. It requires work at the local level, at the state level, and at the national level.
Mm-hmm. I really like this idea, and I too am of the thinking that it wouldn't happen, just because there's a lot of pride in states like California or Texas. They wouldn't can you imagine a Californian saying, "Yeah, I'm okay with turning California into 3 separate states, even if it had a political advantage?" They'd have to redraw their tattoos of their little California outline.
Yeah, it would take a bigger upset even than a lot of people thought the presidential election was a huge upset. I kind of thought it was going to be close. It just seemed to be that kind of campaign. And I think two big mistakes that the Democrats made in the election. One, they seemed somewhat stunned that Mr. Trump actually won the nomination and was a serious candidate.
Yeah.
And so much of the campaign was trying to say, well, we're not we're not represented by Donald Trump. I'm better than Donald Trump. And so you should vote for me because I'm not Donald Trump. And I think people rarely respond to that in an enthusiastic way. Some people do vote based on that, but you've got to present a more forward-thinking, positive vision of why it is that your party and your candidate wants to be president, why they think they should be president, and what they're going to do with it. Of course, both parties lay out lots of plans, but really driving that message home in an authentic way is incredibly important. I think it's ironic that the election turned in the Midwest, where when you really think about the history of the last 8 years before this election, the Midwest was in deep economic trouble. And of course, it was essentially the Obama administration and the Democratic Party that salvaged General Motors and Chrysler. And if they had been allowed to go down, the odds are that Ford, although Ford didn't take any public funding directly, that Ford would have been knocked out too. Wow. And it's certainly a real possibility because if General Motors and Chrysler had really been allowed to go down entirely, the supply chains and all the ancillary businesses that all 3 of them depend upon would have been so badly wounded that it's unlikely, I think, that Ford would have survived either. And so the fact that the auto industry, which came under a lot of attack by Republicans in Congress and many of the Republican presidential candidates at the time, why the Democrats were able or allowed the Republicans to make the case in the Midwest that manufacturing was something the Republicans were going to support, and they were going to provide a much better life for the working class. And I think what really happened is that there was a sense that people were getting taken for granted, and a failure to really spend time there to hammer on the messages of what the history was, what had been done, and most importantly, what was going to be done going forward to continue the momentum. The economy was already, frankly, pretty good in general, but for a lot of people, it's been tough, and it's still tough. And it's important that people pay attention to that. We have a great amount of disparity in wealth in this country, and opportunity is widely disparate. We have quite a number of things to celebrate, but we have a lot of things to be concerned about and to work about. And I think it's important, whenever somebody seeks to be a leader, to get involved in politics or change, to never underestimate the importance or value of human beings all over, whatever their politics are, whatever their background is, whatever their skill levels are.
Mm-hmm. And to me, this seems like it's a problem that's only going to get worse in terms of the level of automation that's happening. I mean, factory jobs as they were are not going to come back because robots and machinery and technology is going to take care of a lot of those menial tasks.
I don't know if you've seen it. There's a very interesting book called The Machine Age by two economists that talk about that very factor, and also kind of saying that the second machine age, it's called, kind of comparing and contrasting the Industrial Revolution and the impact that had with the computer automation revolution that we're having now. And their point is that the challenges are, even though we had, of course, great wealth disparity and similar problems after the Industrial Revolution, we also had lots of benefits, and we did sort of figure out how to deal with that and spread the benefits that were coming from technology. But they're pointing out that it's going to be, as you said, a much more difficult challenge this time around. And here's just one little example they give. They say, yes, it's true that a lot of wealth and power rose to a few people who were innovators in the Industrial Revolution. But when somebody invented a car, a new engine, or something like that, it still had to be mass produced, and that required a very large workforce. As you point out, when you're talking about a piece of software or something that can be automated without human involvement, there will always be plenty of room for humans, but the tendency is for so much more of it. If somebody invents a new application or a program, that can be replicated essentially for free and distributed to millions or hundreds of millions of people. And so the normal pyramid spreading of the opportunity and the jobs and the wealth doesn't come automatically. So we're going to have to think very hard and have a new set of policies and priorities to deal with that. So it's not just an economic cycle or even government policy that is causing many of the challenges and the difficulties we have.
Yeah, and even more than just like factory work or producing products, one of the biggest careers or jobs that people in, I think it's like 38 states, is something to do with driving, like truck drivers or transportation, taxi, what have you. All that could really go away in the next, I mean, I don't know the numbers, but 15, 20, 25 years.
Right. Driverless technology is coming fast. I mean, as always, my guess is that the projections that we're on the threshold of it are a little optimistic.
I think so too.
But it is going to come, clearly, and you're absolutely right. Now, the amazing thing about the economy, for at least those political systems that are able to be adaptable and set up reasonable policies, it does seem over time that the world is amazingly adaptable. Humans are amazingly adaptable, and we have overcome challenges certainly as big or bigger than we're going to be facing. But they're new, which means we don't have a blueprint for them, and I think it is going to take a period of time to figure out. We know that some things that don't work anymore,
Mm-hmm.
figuring out what's going to work in the future is going to be the challenge for your generation, frankly. But I have confidence. That's one reason I remain optimistic despite everybody pulling their hair out and wringing their hands. I mean, there are an enormous number of challenges,
Mm-hmm.
and the other side of technology and automation is that it has sped up change so much that
That's true.
mistakes can be amplified. So,
Mm-hmm.
the world is, the human institutions always make big mistakes. So it's one of the good sense understandings our framers had. That's one of the reasons they divided power around in so many different places, because they realized one state, one branch of government, one part of Congress could easily, for a period of time, really go off the deep end. And having at least some buffers and some other institutions in play was a good way to try and make sure that didn't happen. These days, push of a button, a catastrophic failure in the electric grid, some international incident, there isn't a few years to recover sometimes. And so we are in a more fraught, more difficult period of time. It's going to be a real challenge, I think, for humans to keep up in our social institutions and our political institutions with the changes that are coming.
I think I remain pretty optimistic as well. There's some new programs that I think are really interesting. I don't know, are you familiar with universal basic income? The idea.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I think that really could be the future. I mean, if we're going to continue doing capitalism in an age of innovation and automation, there has to be some mechanism or program that makes it so people can get their basic needs met and through free money from the government, essentially. And I think, I don't know, universal basic income is something that I think everyone should look into and really examine, but a lot of people are really skeptical about it, and I don't know if the skepticism is really warranted.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to think, remember which country was coming close to giving it a try.
There's a couple. I think Finland is trying it, and I think Switzerland's thinking about it. There's a province in Canada, I think Ottawa might try it. And I wish I remembered which country it was, but my professor was talking about they're going to give a certain population of people in this country a monthly wage, but they're not going to discourage people from going out and pursuing work and trying to get a job. And they say, even if you get a job, we'll continue to give you this basic wage. And that's to combat the idea that if people get this universal income, that they're not going to be they're going to become apathetic and not want to work. And that to me seems, I don't know, that just seems like a statement that people make that doesn't have any basis in reality of how people operate. Because no one's just going to not do what they want to do in life if you have stability and you are an artist, or you want to go make film, or want to help people in the community, or you do organic farming, you're going to do that, and you're going to be able to do that more comfortably because you're taken care of. You don't have to have a 9-to-5 job, for instance. So I think that's interesting.
Yeah, well, it'll be interesting to see if it really does get run as an experiment in a broad enough setting that you can really test it. And of course, I'm not really that familiar with it, but some of the skepticism comes from the question of whether it's financially viable, if you can really provide enough money to make it work. Because presumably the purest forms of it that I've heard of is essentially replace a lot of social welfare programs with this stipend or minimum guarantee, and then expect that people would be able to access a minimum reasonable level of healthcare and housing and education and all the other things that are necessary. And so, but it's going to be, it's certainly an innovative thought. And I would just say, I think the most powerful human motivations to do things are in fact internally driven. I agree with you. But I also do think, the world history tends to indicate that incentives work too.
Yeah, that's true.
And so, or a lack of incentives sometimes have a negative effect. Not for everybody, certainly, but as you described it, you're talking about a mixed system where you're not going to discourage incentives. You don't want systems that discourage people from pursuing their calling and their passion and their work. But I think that's an interesting approach. Another thing that we had talked about, which really doesn't go so much to how we're going to address these major cataclysmic changes, but what people should be thinking about and doing in politics when they see things that they don't like or that they think are inappropriate. And it's certainly important that people make their voices heard. And I think one of the reasons I was fairly optimistic a couple of months ago when we talked, and I think it's been borne out, is that people are willing to stand up for things that they care deeply about. There's a lot of times when politics can be very blasé. There's times when I certainly want to get away from it, and I'm sure we all do. If it's not your full-time pursuit, then you can't. You don't spend all your life. But when something's really important, when people get inspired or are concerned about something, they show usually that, generally speaking, in our country, people eventually come to it. And I'm reminded of Winston Churchill's comment about America, which I hope is accurate. Before we entered World War II, we were giving some aid, but we hadn't entered the war yet. And he was sitting around with his war cabinet, apparently, and he said to them, "Don't worry about America. I never worry about America. They always do the right thing." And he stopped, and all of his advisors looked at him like he was absolutely crazy, because, of course, we've done a lot of foolish things, and we were not real ready to go. And then after a long pause, he said, "After they've exhausted every other reasonable possibility." And, sometimes you can get frustrated or discouraged about our politics in any short-term window, but I do think that, and I don't mean to take it lightly, because each generation does have to rededicate itself to our liberties and to notions of equality and to progress that we've made and a forthright acknowledgement of things that we haven't yet done, that we haven't solved. And so each generation needs to make that recommitment. It doesn't run like clockwork by itself, but at the end of the day, I still have a good deal of faith in the common sense wisdom of American people. And you can, of course, appeal from a demagogic point of view, or you can appeal to their better angels. And usually when they're engaged, fully engaged, they make fairly sensible decisions about things.
Yeah, one would hope. So what are your feelings about a lot of the protests that have been happening? I remember during our event, you kind of talked about grassroots movements and some forms of civil disobedience being kind of go hand in hand with law, that those kind of two things need each other to exist.
Well, certainly it's a very fine line. I mean, first of all, I would say I think it's a mistake to be against everything. And I do think there are some people on both sides of the political spectrum who decide when their side loses, they're going to be against everything. I think, frankly, President Obama faced a lot of that from Republicans. The Congress was pretty obstructionist. But I don't think it's useful for the Democrats to turn around, or progressives to turn around and say, well, that's what they did, we're going to do it, and we're going to multiply it. I just don't think that's helpful. I think it is important to recognize there is a role for a loyal opposition within the system, and to pick out the things that are really of concern and fight like crazy over those, but also be reasonable and allow the government to function, help it function, try and make it function well. Don't compromise your principles, but don't be an obstructionist just to be an obstructionist. And I think there were some mistakes made on that, in my opinion. I mean, everybody has to make their own judgment, but in looking at appointments, for example, our confirmation process, frankly, has been in some trouble for a long period of time, and from both sides. And I really think that, I mean, there were some folks who I respect in general who said things like, I don't care who he nominates. The fact that he's nominating him means I'm going to be opposed. Mm-hmm. That is not a valid way to look at a nomination for a court or for a government office. And, you know, I suspect that's not, in fact, how people end up voting generally in Congress, but in the Senate when they're doing the confirmation. But there has been some of that. And I think it's very important to try and get the confirmation process back in a reasonable level. And pick a few. I mean, there have been some nominees that I would have opposed strenuously if I had been senator, but I wouldn't oppose them all. There have been some decent nominees, and they're not necessarily people that I would nominate, but you know that's the way our politics goes. But there's certainly been a number of very qualified people. It's too early to tell, but I think that, for example, Judge Gorsuch, while I don't agree with him on too much of his judicial philosophy. From what I know so far, he seems like an even-tempered, well-qualified judge. If that turns out to be the case after his confirmation hearing, then I think the Democrats should vote for him and keep their powder dry. There may be future appointments to the Supreme Court who aren't so qualified or who are going to be in a position to make a much more significant difference in a negative way. And, you know, frankly, if you look at the list of people who are being considered, and again, this is before the hearing and nobody should prejudge what's going to happen, but I think most reasonably aware people looking at that list would have said, well, you know, Judge Gorsuch is one of the better candidates. I could live with that under normal circumstances. And so the mere fact that it's coming from a president somebody might not like or a president somebody doesn't agree with, it does not mean they shouldn't be confirmed. The same, of course, should have been true for Merrick Garland, who was also very well qualified, who was nominated by President Obama and left hanging for nearly a year. But I would say the time for that fight was when he was nominated and during the pendency of that nomination. And frankly, that's one that the Democrats should have fought tooth and nail last session of the Senate to get him a hearing and just hammered on it day after day. And frankly, well, of course, they complained, but they didn't really put up as much of a fight as they should have put up. And the fact that that was unsuccessful and the Republicans incorrectly, unfairly blocked him is not a reason not to fairly consider Judge Gorsuch. You know, who knows, something may come out in the hearing to disqualify him, but you know, at this point at least, he certainly deserves a fair hearing, and if he, you know, if nothing significantly negative comes out in that hearing, he should, in my opinion, be supported. But to come back to the protest point, yes, I mean, if you look at most of the big progressive changes in our country throughout our history, it has partly been done politically, partly legally, but most of it, frankly, has been driven by the grassroots. And that includes political action, includes protest, it has included civil disobedience in occasions, and you know, I think that's certainly been appropriate in the civil rights movement, many other, the labor movement, women's suffrage, for sure. I mean, every major change that we've had, rights of the LGBT community and so on. So it is an important part. I think, you know, I think anybody thinking about that does have to think carefully and take responsibilities. Civil disobedience is not just go do whatever you want. First of all, I'm a complete believer in the importance of nonviolence. And it's, you know, I think from a moral point of view, from a legal point of view, and from an effectiveness point of view, nonviolence, especially in a system that is a functioning constitutional democracy, is really the only justifiable way to proceed. And as a first instance, for sure, people should first try and get their message out, protest lawfully. Occasionally, as we've seen in history, either because the laws are constructed unconstitutionally and the institutions are unmovable, there's no option of doing that, and civil disobedience, even occasional illegal conduct, at least illegal compared to the local statute, is required or justified, but the person or the organization has to be willing to take the consequences if they're going to do that and make their argument in the courts. And of course, that's what we were very fortunate to have Martin Luther King and many others in the civil rights movement and the leaders in the women's movement, as you said, and many other movements that were able to do that and handle it with such dignity and grace and fight in the courts so that it eventually brought the conscience of the country around. And so all these things go hand in glove. I mean, if you look at the civil rights movement, obviously the Supreme Court played a very important role in Brown versus Board in '54, but without the civil rights movement itself, that either wouldn't have happened, or even if it had, it would have been a dead letter and would not have really made a major impact. So, obviously the continued pressure and the civil rights acts in the '60s, and it's an effort we're still engaged in. We have not completely come close to erasing the disjunction between the Declaration's promise of equality and the Constitution's acknowledgement of slavery, protection of slavery. We've made a lot of, excuse me. As a culture, we've come a long way, but it's a big mistake to rest on our laurels. There's a lot more work to be done, and a lot of new areas that have developed.
Well, and that's an interesting thing when you talk about the 13th Amendment and how the actual writing is slavery shall be abolished except for as a form of punishment to a crime. I mean, that justifies the
involuntary servitude. It doesn't say you can make a prisoner a slave, but just, it's a technical matter. But
that's fair.
Yeah.
Involuntary servitude. Yeah, that's correct. You would know.
It abolishes slavery.
But, now we have this huge industrial prison complex where all kinds of products are being made in prisons, and all of this labor that's going essentially unpaid, or like 99 cents an hour, I think, in some cases. Do you think there's a way that the 13th Amendment can be, changed to kind of combat this problem, or is that really not the issue?
Yeah, I don't honestly. I think the problem. It is a political problem. We need major criminal justice reform in this country, sentencing reform. I'm deeply concerned, as I take it you are, about the movement to privatize incarceration. It's strikes me, if there's any function in addition to war making and that incarceration is a function that should be relatively rare, sort of treated like a scarce natural resource, but that the government has a responsibility. We as people have a responsibility. If we're going to impose that stigma and that sanction on a human being, it needs to be a public function and not a private function. So I am unalterably opposed to private prisons. And I think that's where a lot of the problem is, because, as you say, even in public prisons, we've had huge problems there too. But the courts at least can do a better job of supervising those. The private system, of course, profit is the motive. Yeah. At least in the public system, yes, they're underfunded, and we're sending way too many people to prison in this country. There are many other things we could and should be doing that would be a lot more economical and a lot more humane, more importantly. There are, of course, some people that we don't have good answers for that we do need to incarcerate, but our incarceration rates are really shameful. And though And some of the things we've put people in prison for are really unfortunate. I do think actually that there's a ray of hope in this area, in that a combination of good events, virtuous circle is sort of coming, that people are beginning to realize, among everything else, it costs a heck of a lot of money, and there are ways we could do things more cheaply. So that has kind of combined with the realization by lots of corrections officials and people in the justice system that this is not a good way to go. I mean, even I think our current Attorney General actually, one good thing that he did in his prior career was to complain about the disparity in cocaine punishments between crack and powder that had great racial disparities. And I think there's a potential for sort of a non-partisan effort to make some progress, some headway in this area.
Well, and it's hard when there's lobbyists for like prison guard lobbyists or lobbyists for companies that deliver food to prisons and so forth that are advocating against the legalization of marijuana, for instance, just because that is such a high number of people incarcerated. And to me, it makes the fact that they're allowed to pump this much money into lobbying against that just shouldn't be allowed. But how do you stop it? I don't know.
Yeah, and of course, even as I say, I would just have a flat policy that you don't have private prisons.
Yeah.
Start. Now, even so, of course, there's still lots of people that are making money off corrections in general, or whose livelihood depends upon it. You're always going to have lobbying or interested groups that don't want any change to their source of income. But you're absolutely right. It's going to be a heavy lift. There's a lot of money, and your initial description of the prison industrial complex, sort of parallelizing Eisenhower's talk about the military industrial complex is absolutely correct. But I do think that that there's at least a window of opportunity for some political improvement in this area, and that despite the lobbying, it's not going to be easy, it's not going to go overnight, but I do think an awful lot of people are receptive, and I think particularly the drug war turned out to kind of be such a failure, and not only an actual failure, but I think that message has penetrated the consciousness of a lot of people. And so, you mentioned marijuana. I think that the states that are experimenting so far, including, of course, Oregon, that it'll take time, but my guess is that it won't be another generation, and we'll have obviously decriminalization of marijuana. And the more important thing is with respect to other drugs. I mean, that's an important issue for sure, but with respect to other drugs, is changing our focus from dealing with it primarily as a criminal problem and looking at it more as a social medical issue.
Absolutely.
Because there are definitely deleterious effects from a lot of our drugs. The opioid crisis, the meth problems are quite significant, and pretending they're not problems is not going to solve anything. But we could and should be much more effective and treat it as the real social and medical problem that it is.
Yeah, well, you look at countries like Portugal, where I believe they just decriminalized all drugs, and
possession, use.
And instead, focused on dealing with rehabilitation or awareness and education, and they've had significantly less problems with crime and I think deaths, and the prison rate went way down too.
Right.
I think that's an interesting idea. Do I think that that's a possibility in this country anytime soon?
Not universal, no. Not. But I think states are going to do more and more experimenting, and the trend, for a long time, the trend was in the opposite, the wrong direction. I think finally the battleship is getting turned a little bit, and there's an opportunity to start making some progress.
That's interesting. Um, at the event, you mentioned Rodriguez and the Searching for Sugar Man documentary. For anyone that hasn't seen that documentary, you need to see it. He had made 2 albums in early 70s, 71 and 73, I think. And on his first album, Cold Facts, there's a song called The Establishment Blues. And it's an incredible song where he basically lists off a lot of social issues revolving around crime or pollution and, just various different things. Everyone having guns, divorce rates going up, amongst other issues. And to me, it's amazing because that song was written about 50 years ago.
Right.
And nothing has changed whatsoever.
Yeah. No, and it's funny because music, even law, is very culturally based in many respects.
Mm-hmm.
But you take Rodriguez, for listeners who aren't familiar with him, you should go listen to his music, Sixto Rodriguez, and the documentary is a great documentary, Searching for Sugar Man. I'll just mention the producer of that movie, by the way, also made another great documentary about Man on Wire, about the guy that walked the tightrope between the Twin Towers. He was the producer, not the different director. But
Okay.
Yeah, same producer. But anyway, the amazing thing about Rodriguez's music, set in Detroit from an American urban setting, and his music became, in many respects, critical to the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. He was not known at all in the United States, but he became this huge cultural hero in South Africa, unbeknownst to him, of course. So it really does speak to, sometimes I think music and the arts tap into something that is more timeless, as you say. It's every bit as fresh and current today, and speaks to a lot of our problems today.
Yeah. What happened was someone brought over one of his records and then made copies of it, which I didn't even know you could do.
Illegally. Yeah,
And
he didn't get any of the money, unfortunately.
Made tons of copies. He never knew. They went and found him and brought him to South Africa to do a show. And now, this documentary came out in 2012, I think, and now he's touring again. He's coming to Portland, what's the theater called down here? The Schnitzer? He's coming to the Schnitzer in April, I think.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
It is an amazing story, and ought to be an inspiration to all students too, because as you say, apparently what happened in South Africa is that he became hugely popular from these underground bootleg records that were being distributed, and they couldn't figure out, even in the apartheid days when South Africa was closed off and no real internet, we hadn't had the internet yet. They couldn't figure out, why are we not hearing anything about this guy? He was bigger to them than the Beatles or the Stones or Elvis. And they'd hear about them. And so a rumor started that he had killed himself at a concert, committed suicide at a concert. And there were 2 different versions of that story, apparently. And as you said, 20 years later, in the 90s, a student decided he was going to do a research project on how did Rodriguez die.
Wow.
And then, they started piecing together information and guessed that he probably was from Detroit. Now, by then there was the internet. They found an old Detroit phone book and got in touch actually with what they thought was going to be his father.
Yeah, it was him, right?
And got on the phone, and it was him. He just got him on the phone. Yeah. And as I recall, I think they asked the question, we hate to bring up a bad memory, but this is a serious research project. How did your son die? And Rodriguez said, "Son, you must have the wrong number. I don't have any sons. I've got daughters."
Yeah.
They talked a little further, and of course it was him. And as you say, the rest, he went to South Africa for this great concert, and now is touring internationally. I think he's in his 70s at this point.
Yeah, he must be. I mean,
what I'd love
50
to know
years ago.
When he comes, I don't think I'll be able to get to the concert, but if somebody gets there, I'd love to know if he's still writing new music and if he performs something new.
I'm curious. I might try to go.
Yeah.
But it's kind of expensive.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, he quit making music after his second album because it didn't sell really, and he did construction work for 20, 30 years.
Yeah, so we'll both put the plug in. Go see Searching for Sugar Man. You can find. I'm sure it's on the web. Somewhere.
Yeah, you can find it pretty easily, I think.
Yeah. It's a great documentary.
Well, someone asked you at the event about the emoluments clause,
Yeah.
and I thought that was an interesting question. And there's some other, questions about legality of some of the things going on currently. And I don't think you had really enough time to answer that question.
Maybe it's a lack of knowledge, but I mean, there are, of course, the big issue that's front and center right now is the immigration order, and I must say, it is interesting that so far every judge that has looked at it, the trial judges in several different districts, and the 3-judge panel from the Ninth Circuit that looked at the first order, have all concluded that it's at least subject to a temporary restraining order stopping it. Now, nobody has ruled on the merits after a full hearing, and it is possible that after a full hearing, a court will uphold part or all of the order. But it is interesting that it's been unanimous so far. I must say, I was not so sure how the second order would come out. And I think that and I'm not sure that the decision so far will stand after full hearing or throughout all of the appellate courts. But certainly major shot across the bow of the administration. And, it's an area, I mean, I think particularly the first order really was dangerous and offensive. I think the second order is terrible too, but it's harder to make the case that it's unconstitutional. For the second one, you really do have to rely upon the underlying intent, inferring the intent of the president. And courts usually are reluctant to do that. So it is interesting that all of these judges so far, of course, we've only two judges on the new order, have said preliminarily, there's good cause to think that the intent may have been to ban based upon religion. So we will see. But coming back to the emoluments clause, there's some interesting arguments out there. To be frank, as I did say at the event, I think it unlikely that the courts would ultimately conclude that the president was violating the emoluments clause because he or his family has businesses that are benefiting. I think they would probably require a closer quid pro quo of something actually being personally given to him by a foreign agent or a foreign
Which would be really hard to prove.
Yeah. I mean, I think they will. It'd be a very difficult case to make. It's a very important issue to discuss, and what the president ought to be doing with his interests and potential conflicts of interest with businesses is a big issue. And certainly there are risks, but I'll be surprised if the emoluments clause actually ends up as a legal case with a result against the president.
Yeah, I don't see that happening either. Well, are you thinking that there's going to be professional baseball in Portland anytime soon?
I'm afraid not. I think I do think Portland, as I've said for many years, done right, Major League Baseball would be a wonderful asset for Portland, and I think Oregon and Southwest Washington would support it if it was done right. But I don't think there's currently a window. There's no team that's currently moving. Baseball eventually will probably expand to additional teams, but frankly, the buy-in cost for that is going to be so extreme.
Yeah.
I doubt that there will be the capital, or that there should be the capital. When I've been a proponent, as you know, of baseball in Portland some years ago, but it was in a window of time when baseball was kind of a low ebb, and the capital investment would have been pretty modest, really, for such a big project, and I think it would have brought all kinds of synergistic benefits to Portland. But right now, I don't see a team moving in the near term, and as I say, I don't really think Portland's likely to be in the expansion game anytime soon. Now, eventually,
Yeah, that could happen.
It could happen, but I don't see anything in the horizon.
Well, especially with the popularity of the Timbers since they've been in the
Yeah.
MLS.
Yeah, they're doing great.
And they took over the old baseball field where the Beavers played, right? The AAA team.
Right.
So
Right.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
that's been a very successful project.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Have you been to a Timbers game?
I have. Yeah, it's
very
exciting.
fun.
Yeah,
It's very fun.
yeah, and it fits Portland very well. I mean, frankly, way back when, my Portland's always been a good soccer town. And,
Yeah, since '75.
and one of the problems that the AAA Beavers had is that once you have a major league level sport with the Blazers,
Mm-hmm.
it's difficult to make minor league baseball work in town. And that's why, in some ways, the little short season single A team out in Hillsborough is doing well because it's a smaller
Hops.
community, the Hops.
Yeah.
A small little intimate ballpark.
Yeah.
Fairly young kids coming to play, and a lot of them stay with the families. That's a very nice scale level to do it.
Mhm.
And so, I think for Portland, you really need major league if you're going to do anything. So short of major league, I was in favor of soccer and think it's a good thing for the city. It shows the city off well.
Yeah. Same.
Absolutely.
The Hops remind me of going to M's games in Eugene when I was a kid. It was fun.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There's something very nice about low-level minor league baseball because and I think actually one of the things I like about professional baseball, there's plenty of money in Major League Baseball. Obviously, It's become a very big industry. But unlike football and basketball, most of the players still do go through the minor leagues, and they start out making very little money. They're traveling by bus often. And I think it's one of the reasons, not that there aren't some problem players in baseball, there have been, but I think in general they tend to be a little more humble and they've had a few more knocks, a little more life experience. Of course, there's some folks that go right away to big contracts, but not nearly as much as in basketball or football. And I think it gives them a little more life experience before they suddenly become famous and wealthy, and allows them to handle it a little bit better.
That's an interesting point. I didn't consider that. Well,
so how often are you doing your podcast these days?
Well, I'm trying to get one in once a week here, starting soon.
Yep.
I'm going to do a couple just solo ones and talk about the program and our organization, and I'm going to get in some people from the conflict resolution program, both professors and students doing cool stuff.
Well, let me say, I mentioned already that I enjoyed the event that was held and
that was fun.
The other speakers, but the nice thing was the earnestness and the intelligence from the audience. It was a very good group, and at the end of the day, as I told you, I am kind of an optimist, but the reason that I'm an optimist is because of that kind of energy in communities. Most of the work has to get done locally in communities and sustained over a long period of time. I've been involved at varying parts of my career with the ACLU, and one of the founders of the ACLU, Roger Baldwin, once said, "No civil liberties issue is ever won forever. You can't just rest on your laurels. You can't just assume somebody else is going to take care of people, or take care of the issue, or take care of our constitutional rights. Every generation has to be rededicated to experience it, to commit to it, and to try and perfect it. We certainly don't live in a perfect society, but we have a lot to be proud of and some things not to be proud of, and it's important for each generation to rededicate themselves and make sure that we continue to grow and develop and improve as a more just society."
I agree. That's what I'm trying to do, hopefully.
Yep, you're doing your part.
Well, thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Alex. Great
This
to
has
see
been
you.
fun.
Yeah.
All right.
Take care.